In medieval Europe, a woman didn't choose her profession. Her birth, her body, and her silence were all that mattered. She was not a citizen, not a worker, and rarely even a wife by choice. She was a vessel, for labor, for pleasure, for blame. If she was born poor, her hands bled for someone else's bread. If she was born noble, her womb was her contract. And if she was born somewhere in between, then her life was often a quiet, endless punishment, hidden beneath the routines of daily survival. This was a world where a woman could be punished for speaking, yet expected to cry at funerals for strangers. Where her milk might be sold before her baby ever saw her. Where her only way to feed herself might mean bathing a man who sees her as furniture. These weren't careers. These were obligations dressed as jobs, performed by women who had no right to say no, and no way out if they did. From the palace chamber to the filth of the fields, these roles reveal the brutal truth of what work meant when you were born the wrong sex. This is not a list of jobs. This is a record of how society turned womanhood into servitude and called it duty. Number 12. The wet nurse. She had milk, and so they took her. Whether she had just given birth or lost a child didn't matter. What mattered was her breasts could feed someone else's baby. In the eyes of the aristocracy, that made her useful, and that meant she no longer had a choice. The wet nurse wasn't hired. She was chosen. Often poor, often grieving, and almost always vulnerable, she was handed a newborn she didn't know and told, "Keep it alive." Sometimes, her own infant was left to starve while she nursed a noble's child. Other times, she had to watch her baby die so that she could continue producing milk for someone who would never remember her name. Her breasts weren't hers anymore. They belonged to the household, to the nursery, to the contracts signed by men. If the child died, she was blamed. If the child lived but grew weak, she was punished. There are records of wet nurses being beaten, imprisoned, even executed for failing their duty. And all the while, they lived on the edges of noble homes, present, essential, and utterly invisible. In some households, they were expected to provide care far beyond milk, changing, cleaning, soothing, and sleeping beside the infant while their own health withered from exhaustion. Some were even forced into further sexual service, since their bodies were already seen as communal. No one asked if she was mourning, bleeding, or ready. Her job began the moment her milk came, and it didn't end until it dried. And when it did, so did her worth. Number 11. The royal bed tester. She was the first to lie where queens would later rest. Her job was to test the royal bed, not just for comfort, but for poison, for spells, and for scandal. In an era obsessed with omens and assassination, no bed was safe until someone else had risked it first. That someone was often a young maid, chosen for her obedience and expendability. She would slip beneath sheets stitched with gold, not knowing if they held lavender or death. Sometimes she'd be tasked with warming the bed for hours, soaking in the sweat and weight of the mattress until it matched the monarch's body. If the linens left her rash-covered or gasping, they'd be changed. If not, the queen would arrive, and the tester would vanish into the background, unacknowledged. In certain courts, the role went beyond comfort and cleanliness. Some bed testers were made to simulate the marriage bed itself, lying in place of the queen during wedding night rehearsals, or worse, as a living decoy if suspicion of dark magic lingered. There were whispers of girls impregnated by kings who thought them someone else, of maids who disappeared after failing the ritual. But none of it mattered. As long as the queen awoke healthy the next day, the girl who lay there first had done her job. She carried no title. She had no defense. And if she died in that bed, the next girl would climb in before the sheets went cold. Number 10. The alewife. She was expected to provide comfort in a cup, but the moment something went wrong, they called her a witch. Brewing ale was one of the few ways a medieval woman could make money on her own, and for that, she paid dearly. An alewife worked with fire, fermentation, and luck. She brewed in her kitchen, stirring thick cauldrons of molten grain with bare arms, hoping the weather wouldn't turn her batch sour. If the beer pleased the village, she was ignored. If it made someone sick, she was cursed. Some were fined. Others were beaten. A few were drowned for sorcery. It didn't matter that men brewed too, women's beer was always more suspicious. And as guilds rose and profits grew, women brewers were pushed out, accused of cheating, poisoning, or consorting with the devil. They said the foam on her beer was unnatural. That the cat in her home was a demon. That her broom, once used to signal ale for sale, was a sign she flew at night. Some aloes wore tall hats to stand above the crowd at markets, a beacon for business that centuries later became the icon of witches. And when bad harvests came or wars spoiled the supply, these women were blamed first, crushed beneath taxes or tied to stakes. She wasn't just brewing. She was surviving in a world waiting to destroy her success. Her hands were burned. Her name was slandered. And all for doing what men would later call industry. Number 9. The bathhouse girl. She didn't sell her body, but her work placed her inches from the men who believed they had bought it. The bathhouse girl was hired to scrub, shave, and serve, usually in silence. In the humid glow of candlelight and steam, her job was to clean the bodies of strangers, washing their backs, oiling their skin, rinsing their hair, and pretending not to flinch when hands wandered too far. She wasn't protected by law. In many towns, she wasn't even acknowledged as a worker. Her proximity to nudity alone made her suspect, and if anything went wrong, if a fight broke out, if a client died, if a rumor spread, she was the one cast out. Sometimes, her duties blurred even further. She might be told to entertain, to flirt, to smile even when the request was vulgar. And if she protested, it was taken as proof that she was already that kind of girl. In cities where bathhouses doubled as brothels, the lines vanished entirely. Many bathhouse girls began as workers and ended as prostitutes, not because they chose to, but because there was no one to stop the shift. They lived among wet floors and wandering eyes, exposed to disease, humiliation, and danger, not just from clients, but from society itself. They were mocked in songs, gossiped about in markets, and judged by women who had no idea how little power they had. She didn't ask to be touched. But she was. And in the end, history barely remembered the difference. Number 8. The milkmaid. She began her mornings before the sun, walking alone into cold, damp fields where the cows waited, and so did the men. The milkmaid's task was simple: extract milk, by hand, from dozens of animals, twice a day, every day. But nothing about her life was simple. Her clothes clung to her from the dew and the labor, her back ached from hours of squatting, and her fingers cracked and bled from the cold. Yet it wasn't the work that broke her, it was the way the world saw her. To many, she was little more than an object in a barn, as much a part of the property as the livestock she tended. Her physical strength, her solitude, her smell of milk and sweat, these were twisted into excuses. Milkmaids were targets. Groped in the stables, cornered in the dark, whispered about in ways no man would dare speak of his own daughter. If she spoke out, she lost her job. If she stayed silent, she lost her safety. In some regions, folk tales even mocked her, branding milkmaids as steger or loose simply because they worked with full-bodied creatures. Her only armor was endurance. She had no guild to defend her, no brotherhood to appeal to. Just the cows, the stool, and the bucket that filled more slowly with each passing year. She worked while bleeding, while bruised, while pregnant, and sometimes while mourning. Because if she stopped, there would always be another girl with calloused hands and no better choice. Number 7. The brothel cleaner. She wasn't a sex worker, yet she lived in the aftermath of sex. Her job began when the moaning stopped and the door closed. In the shadows of the medieval brothel, the cleaner arrived, silent, hunched, and invisible. She changed soiled sheets, wiped blood off floorboards, scrubbed semen from the walls, and plucked lice from pillows. No glove. No mask. No mercy. Her hands burned from the lye, her lungs stung from the smoke of vinegar pots meant to hide the stench of sweat and decay. Every bed told the story she was never allowed to speak of, stories of violence, of girls too young, of men too cruel, of women who never moved again after the door shut. Sometimes she found them cold, purple, silent. When that happened, she cleaned that too. Because there was no one else who would. She couldn't scream. She couldn't cry. And she certainly couldn't tell the church, which already called her tainted by proximity. If a nobleman frequented the house, she had to vanish from sight. If a plague swept through the district, she was blamed first. Some women were sold into this job as punishment, others inherited it from mothers who had nowhere else to go. And though she didn't sell her body, it was used up all the same, by filth, by silence, and by a society that refused to admit she existed. Number 6. The professional mourner. Her tears weren't hers. They were rented. When death came to the wealthy, it was expected that someone would cry loud enough for the gods to hear, and when the family couldn't, or wouldn't, she was summoned. The professional mourner. Draped in black, her voice raw, her fingernails bloodied from clawing her face, she wailed at the edge of the grave like grief itself had taken human form. But there was no sorrow in her heart, only pain in her knees from kneeling too long, only bruises on her lips from biting them until they bled, only exhaustion from playing sadness like a brutal performance. Sometimes she mourned strangers. Sometimes enemies. Sometimes children whose mothers stood dry-eyed beside her. Her cries had to be louder than nature, longer than memory, and convincing enough to satisfy the expectations of honor. But if she faltered, if her sobs weren't convincing, if her eyes ran dry too quickly, she wasn't paid. Worse, she was mocked or accused of cursing the dead. The job didn't end at the funeral. She might be hired to follow the procession barefoot, to tear out her hair on cue, or to spend the night beside the body in an open room lit only by candlelight and dread. Her own losses were irrelevant. Her own dead forgotten. She cried for coin. She wept for status. And she did it until her voice cracked, her skin broke, or her body simply gave out. Because someone had to grieve, loud enough to be heard, and quiet enough to disappear afterward. Number 5. The midwife. She stood at the edge of life, holding one hand out to birth, and the other to death. The medieval midwife was not trained in science, nor protected by law. Yet every scream, every push, every final breath passed through her hands. She arrived when the belly swelled, stayed through the bleeding, and sometimes left carrying the body of the mother, the baby, or both. Her tools were rags, boiling water, and knowledge passed from older women, rarely written, never honored. And when something went wrong, they didn't blame fate. They blamed her. A child born deformed. A stillbirth. A mother who bled too long. To many, it wasn't bad luck, it was witchcraft. She was accused of curses, of consorting with spirits, of stealing a baby's soul during labor. And so the same hands that delivered hundreds of lives could be shackled and burned with no defense but a testimony no man would believe. She worked bent over women screaming in pain, with no relief but whispered prayers and clenched teeth. Some births lasted days. Some ended in silence. And yet, she returned again and again, because without her, no one else would come. She was revered when the baby lived, reviled when it didn't. Her pay was poor. Her risk was absolute. But through her hands, entire generations took their first breath. And if her own breath was silence for it, history barely noticed. Number 4. The laundry wife. She didn't own soap. She made it from ash and fat. Her wash basin wasn't a tub, but a freezing river or a wooden trough cracked from years of use. The laundry wife woke before dawn, dragged filthy linens to frostbitten fields, and knelt in icy water so long her toes turned purple. She scoured blood, bile, and worse from the garments of lords and merchants who never once learned her name. Her fingers split open from lying cold, her knuckles raw, her nails broken. When she bled, the soap stung, but she didn't stop. If a spot remained, she was beaten. If a nobleman's shirt smelled of sweat, she was fined. And if she fell ill, another woman was waiting to take her place for half the coin. There were no gloves, no ringers, no shelter from sleet or wind. In winter, her wet sleeves froze to her skin. In summer, the stench of disease clung to every cloth she touched. Sometimes she washed shrouds from plague victims. No one warned her. No one cared. Children clung to her skirt while she scrubbed, crying from hunger while her arms burned from labor. And when her own clothing tore, she wore rags beneath the piles of fine linen she returned, pressed and spotless. Her labor made others clean while she remained invisible, sore, and soaked to the bone. She didn't just launder clothes, she absorbed the filth of an entire class system, then returned home with nothing but scars. Number 3. The scold's bridal victim. She wasn't given a job, she was given a sentence. And that sentence was silence. In towns across medieval Europe, any woman labeled a scold, too loud, too angry, too opinionated, risked being forced into a punishment that was as humiliating as it was excruciating: the scold's bridle. A heavy iron mask, forged to clamp around her head, fitted with a metal plate that pressed down on her tongue. She couldn't eat, couldn't swallow, and if she tried to speak, her tongue would tear or swell until she choked on it. Some bridles had bells to draw attention, others had spikes to prevent even the twitch of a jaw. Once locked in, she was marched through the village, displayed like a criminal for nothing more than raising her voice. Her husband might have reported her. Her neighbor. The priest. There didn't need to be proof, just complaint. For some, this punishment lasted an hour. For others, a day or longer. And when the mask came off, the damage lingered: dislocated jaws, mangled tongues, infection, or worse. But even more lasting was the message. Women learned quickly that to speak was to suffer. Those who had thoughts learned to whisper them only to themselves. Those who had pain buried it in silence. The bridle was not just iron. It was a tool of social control, one designed to make women's anger disappear from public life. It didn't matter if she was right. It didn't matter if she was trying to protect herself. The louder she was, the faster the mask came. And once it was on, no one listened to her again. Number 2. The lady's maid. She lived among silk and perfume but owned nothing soft. As a lady's maid, her job was to shadow nobility, dressing them, brushing their hair, holding their secrets, and disappearing the moment her presence was inconvenient. She knew everything: when the mistress bled, when the lord visited her chamber, when a child came too soon or a bruise was hidden with powder. Yet she could never speak of it. Her silence was part of her wage, unpaid but expected. She woke before her mistress and slept long after, always on call, always within reach but never allowed to rest. She tightened corsets until her own wrists ached, carried gowns heavier than her body, and endured punishments for mistakes she didn't make. If the mistress was late, it was the maid's fault. If a secret leaked, the maid was beaten. If a scandal broke, she was sent away, penniless. And behind closed doors, she faced other dangers. Not all masters kept their hands to themselves. Not all mistresses defended her. Her own reputation could be destroyed by a single whisper, and unlike the noblewomen she served, she had no name that mattered in court. Sometimes she was the scapegoat for pregnancies, for poisonings, for theft. Other times she simply aged out, discarded for someone younger, quieter, more obedient. Her loyalty was absolute. Her compensation, fragile. She was always present but never seen. Always listening, but never allowed to speak. She wasn't a servant of the household. She was a shadow to the woman who mattered. And when that woman rose in rank or fell from grace, the maid was dragged along, bound not by loyalty, but by survival. Number 1. The field wife. She didn't have a profession, she had a life sentence. The field wife was born into work, married into work, and buried by it. From the moment she could stand, she was expected to carry firewood, water, grain, children. She rose before the sun, often while still nursing a baby, and walked barefoot into cold, uneven soil to sow or harvest what she wouldn't eat. With one hand, she pulled weeds, with the other, she swatted flies from her infant's face. She gave birth in a field, sometimes squatting in the dirt, and returned to digging within the hour. There was no recovery, no rest. Her days were dictated by the land, her nights by the will of her husband. And in both places, she had no control. If the crop failed, she was blamed for bad luck. If she miscarried, she was accused of laziness. If her husband beat her, the priest told her to pray harder. Her hands were swollen, her teeth fell out from malnutrition, and her back curved with the weight of years bent over the earth. She smelled of smoke and damp wool, and in winter, her fingers bled just trying to wring out wet clothing. When she died, it was rarely in bed. It was in the fields, beside the oxen, unnoticed until sunset. There are no statues for her, no names recorded, no ballads sung. But without her, no bread was baked. No children fed. No kingdom stood. She was the foundation. And like all foundations, she was stepped on and forgotten. These were not jobs, they were cages, disguised as duties. Each role, from field to palace, was carved out of necessity and maintained through silence. None of these women applied for the work they did. Most were born into it. Others were punished into it. And all of them were expected to endure it without complaint, without pay, and without history remembering their names. Their bodies were used as tools, to feed, to clean, to birth, to absorb blame, to absorb pain. Their voices, when heard, were punished. Their tears were monetized. Their sweat was invisible. And yet, they kept entire kingdoms running. The truth is, history was not built by kings alone. It was held up by women bent under the weight of obligation, bleeding into linens, crying over strangers' graves, and scrubbing filth from the margins of civilization. Womanhood, in the medieval world, was not a status. It was a sentence. But even within that sentence, they resisted, by surviving, by working, by whispering stories that outlived them. And now, we tell them. Not to pity them, but to remember, the strongest women in history were often the ones we never learned about.